Hello, everyone. How are you? Welcome back to the latest program of The Doctor Will See You Now. As ever, I ask you, how's your reading? Are you enjoying the pages that you're turning? Sometimes we get into books that maybe they don't work for us. Well, let me tell you, I have the perfect antidote for you. A book highly to recommend. If I can say, if now you may be familiar with today's author and you know that you are wanting the next book in the series, but maybe this author's new to you. Again, I highly recommend. Enormous pleasure to welcome into the consultation Tim Sullivan. Hi, Tim. How are you today?
I'm fine, Jackie. How are you?
Doing very, very good, and all the better for being here with you to talk to you about your work, your process, your inspirations, and just to get to the heart of the book that we will be discussing. I wonder if you would do us the honors to hold up that glorious
Sure, of
publication.
course. I happen to have a few copies available.
Look at this, glorious. The Monk. It's the fifth book in the DS Cross thriller series, published by Head of Zeus and out April 2023. As we are in our conversation, of course, I do want to ask you about the creation of DS Cross, because I know for many of us who love our crime fiction, to have an investigator, especially a professional investigator, there are those of us who like our police procedurals, and you've given us a character to follow and love, and that sense of, and here comes the next installment, which is always exciting, I think, to be reacquainted, find out what things are happening. But before we go there, I wonder if we could talk a little bit about you becoming a writer. Well, you have been writing long before you got to crime fiction. Of course, you are a highly acclaimed screenwriter. And I just wondered if you could talk to us about that difference between screenwriting, fiction, textual writing, novel writing. Is there no difference? Are there differences at the risk of making you choose? Do you feel happier in one form than the other? Tell us about yourself.
Um, so I started screenwriting as soon as I left university. Well, I was writing when I was at university. And there is quite a difference. I mean, I've only been writing crime fiction now for 3 years. And part of it was the pandemic. And part of it was also the challenge of I'd always wanted to write prose, to write fiction, to write a novel, but I'd never had the guts really. And I was so busy writing movies. But there are definite differences. I mean, screenplays in a funny sort of way have to they've got far many more considerations in them. How much screen, when it comes down to the technical analysis of it, when you've written it, you find out whether you've overweighed one character in terms of another, which is far more important or far more obvious in screen time than it is in page time. You've got considerations of expense, locations. You don't have that in books. You don't have to think about, well, I'm going to set this scene in Edinburgh. Oh gosh, I've got to get all the crew up there. That's going to cost a fortune, and hotels and whatever. You just write it. But the interesting thing about writing screenplays is they're a really different form, because everyone just thinks it's kind of, you write the movie for the screen, but so much happens between writing the movie and it hitting the screen. And so much happens before, in a sense, before, when you're first writing the movie, even if it's commissioned by a studio, it's a selling document. The studio need to cast it, so you're selling it to actors, you're going to sell it to crew, you're going to sell it to a director. You've got to make, so it starts off as a kind of extended pitch document. But that's a kind of very crass way of putting it. But also, your screenplays have to be a good read, but there's a big difference between a good read on the page and a movie. And some great scripts won't make good movies because something's slightly missing. So they're a pleasurable read, but they're not going to
They
translate.
wouldn't make it onto the screen. And do you think it works vice versa as well? That there are some great stories that would not make it in adaptation?
In terms of books being adapted to,
Yeah.
yeah, no, definitely, particularly books that have an enormous amount of time frames. I mean, everyone always thought The English Patient was going to be an impossible book to, and Anthony Minghella, bless him, proved everyone wrong because it was an incredibly complex. It's to do with different narratives. It's like when you make a movie, if you've got flashbacks, if you're going to another time frame, I'm writing a movie very much like this at the moment. The thing about having flashbacks is you can't just go to a flashback to demonstrate something that happened. Your flashbacks have to be a sequence that have a narrative within themselves so that the audience want to go back to that. They don't want to be taken out of the movie. So if they're enjoying the present time frame and you're taking them back into something they don't particularly want to be in, you lose them from the movie. So it's quite an art.
Yeah, and that idea as well of feeling that the loss of the rhythm as well.
Yeah, I think, but rhythm's an interesting thing because it does come from the writing, but it then comes from performance. It then comes from the way it's shot, and it finally comes from the way it's cut, and then finally the way music is put on it.
So all those layers in the production of film, TV series, as opposed to the work. I suppose as well in that you normally work with a team, do you, as opposed to the solitary writing of the novel author?
To an extent, it's not hugely different because most of when you're writing your first drafts, you're on your own, and then notes come in, and it depends who you're working with. But for a lot of writers, when the movie gets onto set, you're done. Your job is done, and they'll call you if they've got any problems or whatever. But but no, I think writing novels is more solitary, but it's like comparing scrambled eggs to poached eggs.
Yes, yeah. They're eggs, but they're different eggs.
Yeah.
So yeah. But thank you for that. I wondered, as you stepped into the world of novel writing, was there anything that you were concerned about, or were you just ready to do this?
Oh, hugely concerned whether I could do it at all. Hugely concerned whether I could write prose that was engaging. Yeah, no, many, I still have them. Many concerns. I still have a little bit of imposter syndrome going on. It's getting sort of weaker. Like, replenishing a teapot without putting new leaves in it. It's getting sort of weaker, but it's still there to be drunk.
But I'm pleased, that sense of that as you progress, and as the series grows, that then that feeling does diminish. I know, or maybe it's an element that as creatives, practitioners, we need to have. I don't know, because then it keeps us aware. I don't know if it's sort of like it's an element that should be there, and if we don't feel that in part, then there's something, I don't know. I mean, does it motivate? Does it fire us? Or does it immobilize us, like rabbit in the headlights?
Yeah, I think fear is a good thing in creative terms. I think it keeps you on your toes. And with my books, I'm constantly questioning what I'm doing as a reader. So and because George is the way he is, I'm constantly questioning the logic. And if I find holes, I have to solve them. You can't, with a character like George, you can't gloss over them because he just wouldn't let that happen.
No, he would want to know. He would have the questions. I wonder when with the first book was, and when you were creating the first book, was George already fully formed? Did you have the character fully formed before you began the process of that first book?
Yeah, I was determined that my character would have Asperger's, which we must now call autism spectrum condition, because autism's always fascinated me, particularly autism in the workplace. But I knew I couldn't do it without researching. So I'd done 18 months to 2 years of research without putting pen to paper, just on autism. And you know, it's an endlessly fascinating, complex, hard to define condition. And so I had a pretty good idea by the time I got to write who he was. I didn't fully understand the ramifications for me as a writer for my character, because there are certain rules that have to be abided by that can be fantastically frustrating, because George doesn't have gut instincts. He doesn't have feelings about suspects. He just can't. But in a sense, I use Otti, his partner, to not only be a conduit between, an interpreter sometimes between him and the department, but also although he doesn't, it's not that he doesn't approve it, he doesn't really understand it, she can hypothesize, and she can theorize. But it's, you know, I think what people are responding to, because the readers, what we're understanding is the readers are really responding to George. They really love George. Yeah. And that's a very precious thing. I mean, I really love George. And I think for a writer, it's really important to like your lead character. And for me, the character of the investigator is absolutely crucial in successful crime fiction. You know, you look at all the greats, so I'm not comparing myself to, but you look at all the greats and they're all fantastic characters.
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? That the stories that they carry are fascinating and intriguing, but without that central character that you know, and it's almost like I think when you grow to love a series and its main protagonist, it's almost, I don't know, is it a devotion or is it like a family member? And you know, they're very precious to you. And you know, the whole thing of, do we still think about that character when the last page is turned? Do we wonder what they're headed off to next? Do we wonder, you know, what, I don't know, what their choices will be around things? And I think for me, you know, detectives, police officers, private investigators that stick with you long after, you know, no matter their flaws, foibles, even character traits we might not agree with, you know, because I wonder sometimes, do you know, do our protagonists have to be wholly likable for a series to be successful?
Yeah, I don't think they do.
Mhm.
I mean, and I think, you know, some friends of mine in the first book said, gosh, I found him quite challenging at the beginning, but then I came to love him. And I've tried to portray George, you know, at times as inexplicably difficult, but we understand why, and we have to go with it. I mean, I think the secret for me, the important thing that I do that makes a difference is that, you know, I'm just finishing book 6 at the moment, and there's a thread throughout about his relationships with other people.
Yeah.
So there's his father, Raymond, who he has a relationship with, obviously. His mother left him at a young age when he was 4 or 5, and she suddenly reappears.
Yeah.
And that's very difficult for George. There's obviously Otti and her family. And then there's his George is obsessed, like lots of people with autism. They often develop passions or obsessions with things. And George is obsessed by organ music, and he practices the organ in a local Catholic church. And the priest Stephen has become his great friend. And although George doesn't know it, a bit of a counselor. And I think those characters are really important. And I think, you know, when the mother is introduced in one scene in The Patient, right at the end, you want people to go, goodness, what's he going to do? Is she going to appear in book 4? What's he going to do? So I think that's what it's not just what crime is George going to solve next. It's what more is going to happen in his life.
Yeah, and what do we learn more about him, and how does he face these things?
Mm.
The titles of your book are very singular, and for this one, The Monk. And sadly, oh, before we talk about The Monk, you mentioned organ music. Do you share that passion, Tim?
Yes, I love organ music. I can't play. I wish I could. You know, if I wish I could go into a church and play Vidor or something. You know, just I love organ music, and I don't know whether it's from school or whatever, but yeah, I have a great passion for it.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for sharing that. We should maybe get you on the radio show, and you could choose some tunes
Oh yes, yeah, that would be
for
good.
that. Yes, we shall look into that, because we're always up for people choosing different kinds of music
Yeah.
for the
Well,
listeners to
I did
enjoy.
a drama documentary many years ago for World in Action. I directed it. Sylvia Sims as Margaret Thatcher in the final.
Yeah.
It was called Thatcher: The Final Days, and there was a wonderful composer called Patrick Gowers who had worked on the great Sherlock Holmes that I directed with Jeremy Brett, and he did the music. And because Thatcher was so sort of I don't know what the word is really, almost messianic at the end, we actually did the entire soundtrack for that drama documentary for World in Action as church organ music.
Yeah, to set that tone. Yeah. Thank you. This monk, this unfortunate monk, and I just wonder, in the choosing of the titles, and so these characters, why a monk for this book? I mean, do you have your victims stacked up, or
Not necessarily. Why a monk? That's kind of the question. That's the question.
yeah,
You know, the cross and everyone is faced with, which kind of answers the question. Why a monk? Who would want to do this to a monk? But the main question for Cross is why? You know, why would someone kill someone who's been sheltered from public life for 15 years, who's devoted himself to God and lives in a small monastic community in Somerset? Why would this happen? And also, they don't know anything about the past of this victim, because the abbot who would have known about his former life has died. So even the current community don't know much about him. So it just struck me as a really interesting, intriguing concept, really.
yeah, definitely. I love the way, we never know, and I'm pleased to hear, book 6 is in, but I wonder who the will be. Please don't tell. You're probably not allowed, and it'll be a great surprise when it happens. Just to come back to George, and George, the professional, the private George. What is it? What is it that drives George, as that detective? What are the characteristics and traits that you most admire about him?
George, because of the way he is, everything has to be just so in his life. Everything has to be in a certain order, in a certain way for him to cope. He has little foibles, like he doesn't like his food touching other bits of his food. So he eats on separate plates, which means he always eats in the same cafe every morning, because Tony, the cafe, he lives above a cafe, knows this. And, you know, when he has his bacon and eggs and everything's on separate plates. And because everything has to be ordered and organized in such a way, and everything has to be right, that transfers itself into his work, not just in the way that he processes his work, but he is in a quest for things to be right, which means he's in a quest for justice. Things have to be put right. It's that old sociological thing of, in crime fiction, that to an extent, crime fiction puts the world at right. There's got to be a solution at the end to kind of restore order. And that's what George is about. He's all about order. He's also got a sort of passion for justice. He can't bear the notion of injustice. And I think it's partly from when he grew up, and what he had to deal with when he joined the police force, because he wasn't diagnosed. I mean, the first autism spectrum condition diagnosis wasn't, there wasn't one in this country till 1995. So before that, people were just thought of as really rude or difficult or awkward or odd. Yeah. So I think that the George is obsessed with patterns and rhythms, and when he finds something that other detectives might overlook, that's out of the ordinary for his victim, he hones in on it. It could be the smallest thing. She took the bus home every night at 5:30 from work, Monday to Friday. Why the week before she was killed did she not take the bus home on the Wednesday? Now, everyone else is going to go, well, I don't know, she could have lived, whatever. For George, it's significant.
Yeah, there is a reason, and the breaking of the pattern.
Exactly right. And, and his condition is his gift in that way, that he's able to. I watched a documentary once about autism in the workplace with Professor Sir Simon Baron-Cohen, and it was they were trying to find people with autism jobs, and these were high functioning autistic but socially not terribly well functioning, and they were in some business, in some factory or somewhere, and something had gone wrong in the computing sequence. And this autistic guy sat down. They had been working on this for months. And he sat down and he worked out what was wrong. And the reason he worked out what was wrong was that he had the patience to go through all the key strokes that people had done on this program in the last few months till he found the wrong key. Wow. And he solved the whole thing.
Yeah.
And it was just that way of looking at it, but also the patience to do that sort of quite repetitive and laborious job.
And I think that's the thing, isn't it? In a sense, thank you for creating, a character, a voice, where, a spectrum of people who, whose contribution to society is really important in whatever way, and that people see themselves on pages, on the screen.
I've had a lot of correspondence from people who are either got relations with autism, or I had one just a couple of months ago from a young woman saying, thank you so much for writing the George Cross series. It's so good to see a central character with autism at the center of a book. By the way, I'm a serving police officer in the British in the whatever constabulary it was, and I am autistic. Yeah. So it was from an autistic policewoman. Yeah. And that was fantastic for me. Yeah. That was, confirmation that I was doing something right.
Without a doubt. Setting, of all the places in the UK to choose, Bristol. Why? I mean, Bristol's beautiful, gorgeous city, beautiful areas around it. What does Bristol mean to you, and why the choice for George?
Particularly for George, I didn't think he would do as well in a big metropolitan force. Mm-hmm. So Manchester, Newcastle, London were all out for me. But I have a long history in Bristol. My family partly come from Bristol. My grandparents were there. I lived there as a small child, and eventually I was sent to school there. So I've always had a great fondness for Bristol. I think it's a very beautiful place, and I know it. And I always think you're giving yourself a head start if you write about things you know.
Of course. Yeah. And I think that thing as well, you know, as you say, it's not metropolitan crime in that sense of the, you know, those layers again. But nevertheless, you don't make it easy for George in the cases that you give him. You know, so I think, you know, on the one hand, you've made the choice to say, well, it wouldn't work in a bigger metropolitan area. It works here. But I wonder over the 5, and I know you're into the 6th book, I wonder what it is that you are most proud about of this series. What is it that makes your heart sing? Because again, I know maybe as you know, as we were saying, as creatives, we look at things. Is it okay? Was it good enough? What could I? But surely there are maybe a number of aspects that you look and think, God, I did this. This has happened.
You know, I think it has to be the creation of George, but also one of the things I love with George is one of his great skills is the interview. He's just brilliant at interviewing suspects because he doesn't respond emotionally to anything that is said to him. He's not really, he can read it. He's taught himself how to read body language and facial expressions, but it's a disadvantage that that he doesn't respond when they're getting upset, or he'll just, and George has a kind of relentless thing where if he doesn't get an answer, he's perfectly happy to ask a question 20 times in the same inflection with no embarrassment. No, I mean, he could go on all night. And I love that about George. And I love, it's almost in the same way with Maigret and with Columbo, that people take him for granted, or people underestimate him at their peril.
Yeah.
And George is self-aware enough to know that this happens. I mean, when George sits down to do an interview, one of his things is that his folder has to be equally equidistant from the sides of the table. Now, that's a thing that he has to do, but he's not unaware. He's not unaware of the fact that that's having an effect on the people. He doesn't know what that effect is initially, but he knows it's, he's not stupid.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So I think George is, and there are moments of humor with George that I'm very proud of. You know, people write to me and say, "Oh, I laughed out loud. I hope that's okay." And I said, look, you know, all the humor in the books is with George, not at George.
Yes.
If I ever write a piece of humor that's at George, someone tell me. I hope I'm sort of sufficiently self-aware to know that not to do that. But yeah, absolutely, comedy is vital. It's vital for a reader's experience. Not in all thrillers, obviously. I mean, I think
No, but I think, you know, the break in tension as well, but also another aspect to George. You know, I think that's that. You know, that there's a warmth about that humor that is beautiful. So 6 books, but we're with the monk, and I wondered about the process of putting this book together. I sometimes ask authors about, you know, if books were children, you know, your beautiful children, was this a well-behaved book to create, or did you have to wrangle and chastise along the way?
I definitely had to wrangle and put it on the naughty step at times. I mean, I write in I kind of know the area I want to write in. So with the monk, I was an altar boy in my teens at a monastery in Farnborough. And so I took all my experience from, I got to know the monks quite well. I really liked them. Researching something else, I'd spent a long weekend at Buckfast Abbey. And I knew I wanted to write in that world. But I never know. So I know who the victim is. but I never know who the killer is. And that's a bit alarming, because so I kind of create a cast of characters,
Uh-huh.
and I sort of decide on my cast, like if I'm writing a movie, and then I kind of find out who killed him or her as I go along, which is a bit terrifying, because sort of 40,000 words in, you're going, oh my, I just don't know what's going to happen here. Is this really a thriller? Oh, maybe I should throw it away. So it's kind of, it's and with the new one, I've struggled, but then I remind myself I struggle with all of them.
Okay.
And then suddenly you hit a point where you go, wow,
It's happening.
it's
Yeah.
happened and I'm off.
Yeah.
So yeah, they're all, I don't think it would be right if they weren't troublesome. I don't think it would be right. As I say, I constantly challenge myself when writing,
Yeah.
not just from George's perspective, but from a reader's perspective. I can't bear watching TV cop shows where there are howling holes that even I could back a truck through.
Yeah.
They all have to be kind of worked through. And also I think I like to get some themes into the book. So with the monk, it's kind of about religion as well. I mean, I was attracted to the idea of a monastery because I thought George, who is completely not religious, to the extent that he won't play at weddings for his friend, the priest, because he said it would be an act of total hypocrisy. So he's a church organist who won't play at church services. That's, classic George. The setting of a monastery seemed ideal for George Cross.
Yeah.
That if you took the religious bit out, he'd be perfectly at home there.
Perfect. Yeah. 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 The simplicity, the order,
Yeah.
yeah.
Eating in silence.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, and with other books, with the patient, the underlying theme of the patient is assisted suicide, and that debate in the politician, it's about social media and the responsibility of social media, and also the problems of gambling and online gambling, which has suddenly become
Suddenly,
very topical.
yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Because I can't bear it when you watch a football match and they're constantly trying to get audiences to bet, and this is how easy it is. Just press this button, and it's always the most vulnerable. I always remember a friend of mine, when the lottery came out, he had an elderly mother, and he went to see her a few times, and he said to me, he was really concerned because she was losing weight. He was losing quite a lot of weight.
Yeah.
She'd had tests, she didn't have cancer. He couldn't work out what it was. And then one day he finally found out she was spending all her pension money every week on lottery tickets and not food, because she thought one day it'll come and I can give it to my kids.
Yeah.
And it's the same with gambling. That, I think gambling, my grandfather on my maternal side was a terrible gambler. His wife, he was a night watchman at a little gas plant in Bristol. And my grandmother would have to, on the Saturday morning when he'd finished the night shift, she'd have to be at the gates of the plant to get that brown packet off him.
Yeah. Otherwise it was all gone.
Because otherwise it's gone. He's gone to the pub because he's working nights. So for him, it's the end of the day. He's gone to the pub as soon as it's opened, got a bit drunk, and then he's gone to the bookie. He's made some bets, then he's lost a load of money, and then he's gone back to the pub to console himself and gone home with an empty wage packet.
Listen. Yeah. Yeah. I'm really struck by what we're talking about, because the other day on the radio there'd been a program addressing this issue of how the media and online, it's so easy to do this, but then there came on some advertisement for some online gambling, and I'm thinking, how can the radio station, on the one hand, we discuss this and how bad it is and how terrible it is, and there's people coming on talking about the difficulties that they've been in, and then we cut and we promise people this wonderful life.
20 years ago with the IVA, that wouldn't be allowed. I mean,
Yeah.
they censored adverts. You couldn't product place. That's all gone.
Yeah.
It's all gone. So, oh look, here's a program. about the problems of gambling and people, you know, committing suicide or
Yeah,
people ruining their families. Oh, let's put an advert in the middle because everyone listening to it's interested in gambling. I mean, it's immoral. But, you know,
exactly.
I wrote about that in The Politician because I wanted a man who had made a load of money from understanding the potential of the smartphone when it came to gambling.
Yeah.
And he's a religious man. So Cross can say to him, how do you square this? How do you've made money out of people's misery.
Yeah, exactly. Which leads me to ask you then, Tim, do you two aspects about your writing? We talked about tidy closure and, you know, in the times that we live in, I mean, all times have their moments, but I think, you know, the UK at the minute, things are tricky. Um, you know, your work providing a wonderful escape and tidy closure is the one thing I wondered about. And then, do you see yourself as somebody? Is it important for you to address those societal issues and problems in your writing, or does it just come?
It just seems to come out.
Mhm.
It just seems to kind of appear. I didn't set out in The Politician to write about gambling, but I came across an idea for a character, and then I thought that's what I want to write about. And with the monk, you know, you know, a central question for Cross is, you know, to one of the young monks is, doesn't this make you question your faith? And he went, but he was murdered. Yes, but your religion says that everything is an act of God.
So yeah, so
How
has God
can
allow this? Yeah,
how does
yeah.
God allow this? So, you know, that's an interesting debate for
Mhm.
me. And yeah, so I think that, you know, you go back to the golden age of fiction, and they were all puzzles. They were
Yeah,
all kind of, you know, puzzles about, and then we've had sort of buddy crime fiction. I mean, that's not just to dismiss it, but we've had lots of,
I know.
and
Yeah,
and for me, it's just a thing that I think interests readers. Um, and I think that, you know, your books need to have a subtext. It can't just be about A killed B. Was it definitely A? Yes, it was, sent him to prison.
yeah. And I know you can't tell me, but I wonder what that underlying aspect is to book 6. We'll just have to wait and see.
Well, yeah, funnily enough, that was my starting point with this
Yeah,
one.
really.
I knew before I started what I wanted it. Yeah.
Yeah. Tim, I'm aware that the time races as ever, and I know you're a busy man. I am most grateful that you've taken out the time to join us here in the consultation, to speak about your wonderfully drawn character. Again, I said at the beginning, thank you, you know, for
Thank you.
providing, you know, that person that we think, what will happen next? And how will we solve it? And what will we see his experiences along the way? So again, I wish you every success with the monk. Um, and you know, I know we've seen each other in the past in person, which has been wonderful, but I hope we get to do it again in the not too distant future and
Me
talk
too.
some more crime writing.
I'd love that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tim. Have a good day.
And you.
Bye.